I'm Sergey Koshman, and let me introduce our great moderator of the Socrates seminar that we just had in Kyiv. It was international convening, and I'm really happy that our friends from Japan managed to come to Ukraine, and from US and other places. So our great moderator is Bill Powers from MIT Media Lab. He was moderating the Socrates seminar, and today he will be sharing with you the thoughts on the trends that shape our future and how to find meaning and order in chaotic environment that we are living in. So I'm handing over to Bill. His lecture is going to take around 40 minutes, then the question and answer, and then some thoughts from you. The whole lecture will be recorded, so if some of your friends and our colleagues didn't manage to make it, they'll have a possibility to watch it later. Okay? Let's start the journey.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Sergey. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I had a fantastic time the last few days. It was too short. That was the only flaw. But we had a good conversation about technology and the digital age and sort of where we're headed next. And I'm going to give you a talk that's sort of a combination of the things we talked about in our seminar, which some of the folks, as Sergey mentioned, are here, and some broader themes that I'm exploring at MIT, at the lab where I work at MIT, which is at the MIT Media Lab, which is part of MIT. And then within the Media Lab, I'm part of a research group that I'll tell you about. So my title is Order Amid Chaos. I know that in my society, in the US, we feel like we're in a very chaotic moment now. And we also feel that one of the precedents for the chaos that we're living through is Ukraine. Not so much, we don't have the political chaos that you had, but we have political fear and anxiety right now. And we definitely have digital chaos, and particularly in the social media area, which I'll be talking about, and a feeling that things are out of control, that democracy is now happening in this new space, social media, but it's not a very healthy democracy, that it's broken. Lots of people are saying the internet is broken. That's become a very common theme in news media. So the question is, what do we do about it? How do we get out of the chaos? So that image is supposed to be my representation of chaos, and I'll come back to it later in the presentation. So I want to note that I'm originally a journalist and a book writer, and I'm very aware as a writer who writes about technology that it's very dangerous to be predicting the future, because people generally are very wrong when they predict the future. And I have an example. This is Reader's Digest magazine prediction in 1966 of what the world of 1999 would be like. And among other very appealing things, it has us flying around in jetpacks. That was 18 years ago, so we still haven't made it. So they were pretty off about that. Meanwhile, another kind of a prediction, but it was more a statement about modern day times. This is Scientific American magazine. It's truly a sublime sight to behold a machine performing nearly all the functions of a rational being. So it sounds very much like our brilliant robots that we're hearing a lot about, right? And in fact, we talked about the robots in our seminar. This is the year that was written, 1840. Fast forward to the present, and this is a headline from a couple years ago, Wired magazine. Watch this terrifying cheetah robot jump over hurdles. And as it happens, that cheetah robot was built at MIT. So that was built in a lab actually across the street from where I work. Maybe some of you have seen it. I was kind of got a laugh out of this headline, especially the terrifying part. But it does look promising when you look at the picture. It looks like it could be jumping like a cheetah, possibly. And then here's the actual video. Here comes an actual cheetah. That's a real cheetah. Now here's the one that MIT built. Not exactly like a cheetah, I would say. In fact, one of the comments under this on YouTube, the person said, looks more like a robot sheep to me. That's the lawn, by the way, in the front of the university. So here's another one. This is from Boston, where we are, where I work, across the river from Boston. And this is a human, maybe you've seen this, the human robot running through the woods. And it's not a very good runner, as you can see. So my point is, we have all these amazing predictions that we read and actual enthusiastic reports on what's already happening. And often it's not quite up to reality. I get a kick out of that. Just going back to the Scientific American on the robot, the point is these qualifying phrases they put in, nearly all the functions of a rational human being. And in fact, we're still not there yet. So how did I get here? I wrote a book that came out 7 years ago called Hamlet's BlackBerry, Building a Good Life in the Digital Age. And it was about one particular issue of the digital age that was bothering me, which was too much information, my inbox, my social media, the difficulty of navigating all this stuff, and my feeling that it was actually taking over my life. Now, bear in mind, this is 7 years ago, so I was sort of early to this problem. But I had a young child, and I felt like it was separating me from my family life, and it was making it hard to think, and I was getting distracted all the time. So rather than project myself into the future to solve problems, I studied history in university, and what I like to do is actually project myself backwards and try and figure it out from the past. So I went back in history in this book, and I looked at 7 previous tech revolutions and how people navigated those revolutions to pick up some lessons from previous times. So the first person I look at is Socrates, who, believe it or not, lived through a tech revolution, which was the invention of the alphabet. The alphabet arrived in ancient Greece during his lifetime, and people started to use it, and Socrates had all kinds of thoughts about the alphabet. In fact, he was basically a Luddite. He was anti-alphabet. He said, if you start using the alphabet, it will destroy your mind. So sort of a lesson that you got to be open when a tech revolution is happening, and even if things scare you a little bit or they seem to be overwhelming you, maybe it's going to be okay. That book, because it was a pushback against the digital revolution, I didn't think that people would welcome it in the digital world, but to my surprise, they did. I think they were ready for kind of a regular old human being to be speaking up about what they were feeling and what was happening. And they were also feeling it themselves, the people who work at Google and Facebook and these places. And in fact, those were the first speaking invitations I got for the book. I went to Google, I went to Facebook, I went to all these places and spoke. And they were wrestling with this question, and they were fascinated to hear that we've been through questions like this before in history. The biggest surprise I got was that MIT came to me and gave me an appointment, and I wound up being a research scientist there. This is 3 years ago now, at this place, the MIT Media Lab, which is a beautiful building. My lab where I work is up there on the 5th floor, and my colleague Eugene is somewhere here who works with me, he's in the back there, who participated in the seminar. Eugene came to us from Twitter, where he worked before us, and he also worked earlier in various positions in the US government in Washington and abroad. So they invited me, a professor named Deb Roy invited me to join a new lab that he was creating called the Lab for Social Machines. And that's an S turned sideways and an M. And the idea of this lab was that we were rethinking, digital media have been very good at flattening all kinds of landscapes and tearing down old hierarchies, as you know, but not so good at constructing new ones and new ways of solving problems and kind of having a positive effect on society. That's especially true with social media. Twitter gave us a very generous gift with the thought that social media need to be studied more closely, and they also gave us all their data. So we're the only lab in the world with every single tweet going back to the first tweet, all the tweets every day, and basically most of the data that they could give away we have and we're able to do analysis on. So it's part of the Media Lab where the whole idea is kind of technology meets humanity and trying to make sure that technology is serving human beings in a good way and actually taking human beings to a better place. So our lab is a good fit because we're trying to match these new technologies and social media in particular and data in particular with society and with human beings and actually do some good for society. So in the beginning of founding the lab, we explored a bunch of themes. One of the more interesting ones was a theme called mutual transparency, which basically says that we're living through a time in which we're all visible to each other or transparent to each other basically all the time now, thanks to our devices. We can see people across the world doing what they're doing. They can see us if we allow them to. The professor who heads our group, Deb Roy, wrote a an article for Scientific American laying out this idea. Around the time we started the lab, he co-authored it with the philosopher Daniel Dennett. What they did was they looked back at a time in evolutionary history, the Cambrian explosion, when suddenly there was this explosion of life, of prehistoric dinosaurs and so forth. And one of the theories of that time is that the reason there was this sudden explosion of life on Earth is that the composition of the oceans changed, and suddenly they were no longer foggy and impossible for light to penetrate, that the light penetrated the oceans over a long period of time, and suddenly the creatures in the oceans could see each other for the first time. They began to develop eyes because the light gave them a chance to see things. And it was a time of mutual transparency, basically, and the creatures that survived learned to adapt and evolve within this new environment of mutual transparency. And the idea is we have to do the same. And people who forget that they're living in a time of mutual, or organizations that forget they're living in a time of mutual transparency and don't adapt to it. For example, the idea that you're running a company and you have to remember that anything you do as a company, you're basically doing in public, because somebody might have a phone recording what's going on in your store or whatever business you run. That could actually be broadcast to the whole world in 5 minutes. If you don't remember that, it's really you're gonna pay a high price eventually. And there's an example of a company that paid a high price. You all know the story about United Airlines. They forgot that maybe they never realized we live in a time of mutual transparency, and that's what happened. Another project we did in the early days was we heard about a little town in northern Spain called Jun, which is off in the distance there, J-U-N, in southern Spain, where the mayor on his own had the idea to run the town on Twitter, to have all political activity in the town, all communications between citizens and the small government of this town, it has 3,000 people, all take place on the social platform. He was a Twitter addict himself already. He really liked Twitter, and he decided, I'm going to have everybody get on Twitter in the town, and anything that goes wrong, they can just direct tweet me, and I'll get it fixed, and they can attend town meetings on Twitter, and everything can happen on Twitter, and we'll see how it goes. Fantastic experiment. So this is the town hall. Everybody in town, including the town hall, got a Twitter handle. All the people in the town hall who worked there got their work Twitter handles, so if there was something wrong with one of the streets, it was dirty and you wanted it cleaned, you could direct tweet the guy who cleans the streets, and he would go clean it, theoretically, and it would all work out. So we visited the town, 3 of us. This is me and Deb and another of our colleagues, Martin. That's the mayor in the center, and that's the mayor's staff who help him run this basically Twitter government. And it actually was really impressive. It really seems to work. He did get most of not all of the town, but he got a good percentage of the town on Twitter. He even got some people in their 90s to start using Twitter, to actually learn how to use it. He set up an education center so people could learn to use it. And we picked up lots of stories. We spent a week in the town, and people told us things they liked about the experiment, some things they didn't like about it. They gave us examples of stuff they had asked the mayor to do on Twitter, and he had gotten it done very quickly. It sort of sped up the effectiveness of government in the town, which is pretty cool. It's just a small town. A lot of it was riding on his personality, which is very charismatic. But we took it as a kind of a role model for the future, for something that might happen in larger communities around the world. And Deb and I wrote an article about it called The Incredible Jun, a town that runs on social media. And that sort of captured the imagination of other media outlets. And The Guardian and the New York Times and Newsweek and many, many other publications sent reporters to the town, and they wrote about the mayor. And it sort of generated some excitement about this idea, and the idea that maybe it would be actually emulated someday in a big city. So this idea of kind of mutual transparency and these themes that we've been exploring at our lab were in my mind when I got invited to come here and to moderate this seminar at the Aspen Institute Kyiv, and I was very excited about that. Obviously, I'm focused on technology now. I'm not doing journalism. I'm not writing a book at the moment, but I do still have that kind of historical bent of looking to the past to try and find themes and so forth that are helpful today in the digital age. So in planning to come to Kyiv, I started asking around among people in Cambridge where I work. I had coffee with a Ukrainian journalist recently, and I said, is there anyone kind of Socrates-like in Ukrainian culture that I could learn something from and maybe read some of their works and just get a little background on Ukrainian philosophy and culture? She said, well, there is a kind of Socrates of Ukraine. And there he is, and I'm sure a lot of you know who that is. I'm not good at saying it. Skovoroda? Yeah. And I know that he's sort of semi-mythical, and his sayings are kind of strange and mysterious, but I like that about them. So I read a whole bunch of these things that probably you have seen at some point in your education. And one of them struck me as actually echoing what the mutual transparency idea that I just talked about. And it was this one: can a person who is blind at home see clearly in the marketplace? And if you think about it, you know, that's a person who perhaps has all their digital life at home and so forth, and they have their devices, and they're not actually thinking that they are actually in the marketplace all the time. They're out in the public square all the time because this is the digital age and we're all transparent to one another. And of course that brings us back to poor David Dow and what happened to him. So with Skovoroda and all these ideas in mind, I came to Kyiv and we set up a seminar. I worked with Sergey and we came up with 3 themes that we explored in the last couple days that are related to these digital trends. And so I'm going to go through those very quickly and share those with you. And the first one is about artificial intelligence and the future of work, which I'm sure there's discussions of this already in the worlds that you live in Ukraine. The idea that robots are going to take people's jobs and so forth. What I found interesting in preparing the readings that the seminar folks did before we had our meetings the last couple days was I have been doing this seminar for several years now, but I always update the readings. And I noticed that just in the last few years, the writings about this question in the major media and so forth, and in the scholarly media, have changed. A few years ago, everybody was asking, will humans go the way of horses? And we'll be basically useless. And there's been some kind of a transition where that's still a question definitely out there. But now people are talking about how, wait a minute, the robots are not going to replace us. We're actually going to work with the robots. And we're going to have some kind of a co-working arrangement where we're going to help each other in a way. And in fact, how could the robots completely replace us? Because then we wouldn't have anything to do to stay on the earth, and what would be the point of life? But the good news is people are coming up with all kinds of ways to do this. And so we read some articles that kind of got into some themes of this. One of them is partial automation, where there's a process that is partially automated and the robot does that piece of it, and then the human does the other piece. There's something that they called guardian angels in one of the articles, which refers to self-driving cars, and the idea that self-driving cars may never actually be completely self-driving. The human will kind of always be at the controls, but it will have this helper who's kind of looking out for things and giving really, valuable advice as you're moving along the road. Maybe you'll have the steering wheel, maybe they'll have the steering wheel, but it would be kind of a collaborative arrangement. And then the third one is collaborative robots, which is similar to partial automation, but involves more actual, physical collaboration between human and robot. And here's a picture of the latter. That's a guy on an assembly line. That's a robot. And he's actually physically doing stuff where he and the robot do things together. So that's one of the trends we talked about. So my group at the Media Lab is really interested in what's called the public sphere, which is this place where we all gather and talk about politics and talk about current events and so forth. There's a whole academic school of writing about the public sphere that goes back to the mid-20th century. So we taught a course that got into that a few years ago that introduced MIT grad students to this idea that we have a new public sphere today. So this is the old public sphere. The most famous metaphor for the public sphere is what happened in London in the late 17th century when suddenly coffee houses appeared because coffee had arrived from Turkey, and people got really into coffee right away. And people started opening coffee houses like this one. The coffee's being served over there on that side. And an amazing thing happened in these coffee houses. There were newspapers out on the tables, and people started using the news in the newspapers to have debates and discussions about the ideas and the events and the opinions in the newspapers. And this became a new public sphere where people of different classes mixed for the first time. So nobility would come there, and everyday people would come there and order coffee, and they would actually be talking across the class divides. And this was where the very earliest ideas about liberal democracy were really born, that wound up in the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and lots of other developments. So it was a powerful public sphere. Today, we feel that the public sphere is being born on social media, And as I said, it's a troubled public sphere. It's got all kinds of issues. It's partly because it's so huge. It's partly because on the good side, everybody has a voice. On the bad side, when everybody has a voice, it's chaos, and it's very hard to actually figure out what anybody's saying because there's so much to deal with. I'll get in a moment to a project we did recently where we actually tried to harness all those voices to the ground with data science and make some sense of it. But for the moment, I just wanted to share that in the seminar, we saw these overlaps between what happened here with the revolution in Ukraine and the Russians and what happened in our election recently, where you had fake news and you had these bots playing all these sort of hidden roles that you couldn't quite identify behind the scenes, and basically that this public sphere was broken and that it was something you couldn't completely trust and that it was being manipulated from behind the curtain. And that's not a good thing in either case. We took on this project during our election that I just mentioned called the Electome, where we took all that Twitter data that we have every day and we isolated the election conversation within the data every single day, all the tweets about the election. And then we took a huge percentage of the news about the election published every day by major media outlets, New York Times, Washington Post, also right-wing, Breitbart, and so forth. And we took all that news and all that Twitter, isolated the election content, and then we did data analytics on the content so that we could identify trends. And our main focus was on how the election issues, the actual policy issues, were being discussed on the platforms, which was, well, one of them was a platform, Twitter, and in the news. And we tried to show how different events, this is one of the things we did, affected the conversation. So this is just one example. This is an event that wasn't about the election, the terrible shootings we had in Orlando during the election season, but they affected the election conversation. So in collaboration with the Washington Post, we did a story where we showed that 4 election issues were affected by that terrorist event. Guns, LGBT, terrorism, and there should be one more on here. And immigration is the last one. Let me just see why it's not showing up. Anyway, immigration is down here. And we found that it divided between the two political sides. Hillary Clinton's followers, the people who only followed her on Twitter, talked about guns and LGBT, and Trump's followers talked about terrorism and immigration. Thank you, Sergey. So the issues differed depending on who you were following. Eugene, who as I said is in the back there, built an incredible dashboard for us where you had all the data, both Twitter and news. You could toggle between the two huge data sets. You could filter it by issue, you could filter it by candidate, you could filter it by all different kinds of things. And this is the news side. And basically the data appears here in the middle that shows how that particular topic or candidate or whatever was fluctuating with the Twitter public talking about the election. And then this is the actual data. The news stories are the tweets over here. So the reason we built this dashboard was that we got this very unusual invitation to play a role at the presidential debates last fall. Every year we have every 4 years we have 4 final debates before Election Day, where it's run by a government commission, not by a media network. And it's the voters' last chance to really look closely at the two candidates and decide who to vote for. So they asked us to come in. They wanted to bring in the social media public sphere, basically, to the questioning of the candidates. So we were there as partners for the debates. And we provided data, briefing books, and suggested questions to the moderator of each debate. And we also went in person to 2 of the debates. And this is one of the briefing books we provided. This is our colleague Sarush at one of the debates, and he's in the media hall. And we worked with the journalists to try and convert them to use our dashboard to actually write their stories about the election. And he's showing the dashboard there. And those are all the journalists behind him in the media hall. So that was pretty exciting for an academic research lab to be able to play a role at such a big event like that and actually do a real world thing with our data. And we really learned a lot from that, and we're really happy we did it. So to return to my original slide, this is that mysterious chaos that I showed you. And I want to describe now something we did immediately after the election when we had, America was caught off guard and we didn't expect Donald Trump to win. And the media in particular felt a lot of remorse for having missed the signals that the people in the middle of the country basically were sending about who they were going to vote for. And we also learned that people are isolated in these bubbles where they only look at the social media content of people like them and they follow the news of their tribe and so forth. And we did an analysis on that this is actually a visualization of. We did a bunch of analyses of this. And what we basically did is we identified people according to sort of two parameters. People who follow each other and therefore are sort of in the same tribe together somehow, mutual followership. And also people who share content with each other, so people who share news content. We've done a bunch of different analyses using those two categories of data. And I'm going to show you now a video where this is basically a ball of all these voters on Twitter that we identified. How many are in here, Eugene? Hundreds of thousands? This is 8,000? Okay. This is people who talked about particular issues. And it's now going to resolve itself so that you'll see them gathering in their tribes that they were in when they were talking about the election, during the election. This takes just a few seconds to resolve. So there's one up there. There's another. And now this is a mouse hovering over the nodes, over the dots. And each time it stops, that's one person on Twitter, and it shows what issue they care about most. That's what the arrow's pointing to. That's the issue they tweet about the most. So we're getting a sense of what the people in these different clusters actually were talking about with each other. So that's real data, as I said. It's not an imagined version of it. These are the actual nodes of the people. And so this is where it winds up. And basically, these people, this red fireball on the right is the Trump people. That's the Trump tribe. Very closely tied to each other. You can see it's such a tight ball that it doesn't look like it's separate dots. It looks like it's all kind of one blob. Then over here, as you move this way, you get people who follow both. And then this is the people who follow Clinton and Trump, then the Clinton people going up that side, and then the Bernie Sanders people up on top. And now those blinkers are the journalists. So notice the journalists have no connections almost to the Trump people. So that helps explain why the media didn't tell the nation that this guy was on the verge of winning, because they actually weren't connected to the Trump people at all. And that's not just Trump's people in his campaign, that's voters and, everyday people who were in the conversation talking about certain issues. So we published this with Vice News, which is a kind of digitally focused news outlet. And this was one of the headlines they ran. The media bubble is real. Almost no verified journalists have a national information flow with most Trump supporters on Twitter. There's little overlap between their mutual follower networks. This was the second most passed around piece of news in the history of Vice News, which is a pretty popular outlet. So that tells you people are interested in this problem, and we were glad we were able to shed some light on it. So that's the end of my public sphere section. And then the last theme we talked about in our seminar, this is the one we did today, is about the rise of the humanities and the return of the humanities. And one thing I can tell you from my studies of history is that whenever there's a big tech revolution, at a certain point, there's a kind of a return to humanistic traditions, to the arts, to literature, to philosophy, to thinking about ways that we can make sense of the new technology and the way it's changing our lives. This particularly happened after the Enlightenment, was sort of not winding down, but the Enlightenment carried kind of into the 1700s, and then the early 1800s you had the Romantic movement, which was a movement in poetry and visual arts and philosophy that was an example of sort of the humanities having a resurgence as people tried to make sense of the revolution they were living through. So one of the articles that we read for today's conversation was called How to Think Like Shakespeare. And it's basically an example of these stories that are coming out now, articles and books that are about going back to humanistic traditions to try and bring together the human and the technology into a greater whole, so that we can take the revolution to a good place that's about us and our society being a healthier place, and not just about the robots having a nicer world. And I think that's very doable. I'm very optimistic about it. Speaking of philosophers, I was very happy to discover this picture online of Skovoroda with a phone, and that was just there waiting for me. I actually just put his name in again and noticed that this came up. And this is the second quote of his that I found interesting. Water cannot exist without fish, just as air without birds, just as time without people. Sort of a mysterious quote, if you think about it, and not literally true, probably. But what it reminds me is that, in a sense, we make the world that we're in by our actions, by the things we decide to do, by the way we decide to shape our reality, and that's exactly what we're doing with technology. It's in our hands. We can take it to a better place. We will take it to a better place, I'm sure. And we have to remember that we're just in the very early days of this. And that's why it feels like chaos. There is no order because this is very early for there to be any order in a situation like this. So it's really like an open field for each of us to run with and make a contribution to. I had a feeling in our seminar today that there's a hunger for that and that people feel we can do it. And we're taking baby steps now. I think there'll be bigger steps as we move forward. And I hope all of you want to be part of that. So with that, I thank you for listening, and I would love to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
My name is Ruslan. I'm what I call a chief opportunity officer for businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So I work as a freelancer. My question is more related to the philosophy and an understanding of the modern society in the way that for the whole longevity of our history, we were kind of trying to make everything in order as we understood it.
Mm-hmm.
Despite the fact that life is very chaotic and we did all we could to embrace order,
You mean going all the way back
shouldn't
in
we
history?
actually
Yeah.
embrace chaos? Because this is what life is about.
Great question. Great question. We did talk about chaos a fair amount, and whether or not, what was it, Sergey? Chaos came out of cosmos? Something like that. Cosmos came out of chaos. Yeah, so I get your point. I am a person who, and this is probably just a personality type, who likes order. And for example, in an election, I didn't like 4 years ago in that election, looking at my Twitter and like having no idea. I was seeing 20 tweets at a time, but I had no idea. Do those represent 20 million people? Do they represent 200 people? It just felt very random, you know. So the time I was spending on social media following the election wasn't very useful to me, really, and I wanted it to be more useful. So I think that's a case in which you want order because you want to be able to make an informed decision. Now, having said that, we all know that this election we know now that our election was manipulated. And so in many ways, the data was less trustworthy than many of us thought it was, including us in our project. We actually filtered out a lot of those bots, so we weren't seeing a lot of that stuff anyway. So I think I'm not a chaos person in the end. I think some people have a really high tolerance for it. You sound like you're one of them. I also think older people get a little tired of chaos after a while, especially when you've had kids and you're like, okay, enough chaos. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
My name is Natalia Shulga. Actually, I belong to academia. I'm very surprised that journalist was called to do some research. It's probably about MIT.
Oh.
So my question is, with your understanding that this election can be visualized and the way it was, can you interpret this data for us? Because for me it looks like the group which support Trump is kind of very orderly group, very primitive, and that's why it's kind of composed like
Cohesive.
that. Right,
Yeah.
cohesive. And for Clinton supporters, it's more diversity. And in terms of evolution, we know that diversity actually is a very positive thing for development, for freedom, for exchange. How would you interpret this data for the future of elections in the United States? And also, I assume that your experience would be used by different countries because it's a solid data and solid methodology. This is the first question. And the second question, would you be able, with these skills and these instruments, to kind of fight this so-called post-truth situation with the media? Because it's extremely difficult to really have the arguments now, because as a scientist, for me, it's no problem. I can distinguish between facts and lies.
Yes.
But for regular people who are not trained to be professional scientists, they look through the media, they look through the TV or newspapers or tweets or Facebook, and it's extremely difficult for regular people to distinguish. So would you be able, with your instruments and methodology, to kind of put the filter for the regular people?
Thank you. Thank you. So on your first question about the data and about the Hillary people being more diverse, I don't know if that's exactly the word, because what you were seeing there was how tightly connected they were. So I guess that means they had other people they're loosely connected to, and sort of it looks like a roomier tribe, but it was still a tribe. It was still like Hillary world, basically. What the tightness of the Trump fireball, as we call it, shows is a kind of a passion. We saw this over and over in our data, that when Trump ran into trouble, his people rushed in to defend him. We called it the passion gap. And they were like incredibly strong in defending him. And I'm not talking mostly about bots, because we looked at this data ourselves, and it was real people. And meanwhile, when Clinton got into trouble, and sometimes there was a week when they both got into trouble, like within days of each other, like she had the FBI director come out against her, and he had the Access Hollywood salacious tape come out. When she got into trouble like that week, her people were really not passionate in defending her, and they actually didn't rise up in anywhere near the same numbers. So that looseness may also reflect on some level, because they're not in a tight tribe of sort of true believers, she had less backing in a way. And she was a kind of a weak candidate as a person. You know, she just doesn't project kind of an authenticity that Americans tend to look for. And I think that was a factor in her losing, in addition to Putin being a big factor, it seems. So I think we can teach people a lot with our methods that we use. The isolation of the election conversation in the data, which sounds like sort of a boring thing to have done, that was actually a huge challenge. To be able to go into all that chaos, really, of the data and say, here's the election conversation. And we were able to do that with over 90% accuracy every day. That was really a valuable thing. And that can now be done for anything. It doesn't have to be an election. It could be any event that people are talking about on a social medium. Algorithms like the ones we developed could be used to, they were really groundbreaking. So we felt that that was something that we can now hand off to people. It's being published, it's been presented at conferences, that people can use to actually focus the conversation and bring some order to it and do their own versions of that in whatever society they're in. We're talking to some folks in the Spanish-speaking world about possibly collaborating with them about applying this to some of the elections in that world, where I understand there have been very Trump-like candidates who have used social media, Twitter in particular, in similar ways. I know Facebook is the one here, but in a lot of South America in particular, it's Twitter. So that was question one. And then question two is about sort of fake news, right? And can we help with that? So we do have one research project that's going on fake news. There's an awful lot of them out there that both news outlets and scientists are working on. Facebook has a whole big effort around it now, as you probably know. I don't know that it's going to be solved. I think it's a really, really big problem for artificial intelligence to distinguish between truth and fiction. That's a big one, because it's very easy. Once you know what they're looking for, you can just shift it if you're the person who's trying to deceive them. And you know, one thing I've learned in this lab in the last 3 years, we do semantic analysis, and that's really, really hard for computers. You know, it's so nuanced. Human language is amazing. You know, it's got so many gray areas, and that was the steepest hill we were climbing the whole time, was getting the artificial intelligence to spit out language analysis that really hung together. We really did it for the isolation of the election conversation, but other things we tried to do, we had to actually step back and not publish it because it wasn't working. So, thank you.
Olha Bossak, I'm a management consultant.
Hi.
So could you please elaborate a little bit more on why there was no connection between Trump and media? Right, first question.
Yeah.
A second question, I was in New York before elections, after elections, so I saw people crying because Americans got Trump as the president, but I also met people who were more for Trump than for Clinton, even though they suggested both of them are evil for the country, but even though Trump could be better. And those people are people with majors from, you know, famous universities, you know, high positions, quite successful. So what I've noticed, media were very, very anti-Trump in a way, but there were people who are not necessarily very you know, very like primitive, you know,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
not only representing working class but also supporting Trump.
Yeah.
But they were even afraid to go public with their thoughts and with their positions. And I felt like that's like kind of an influence of media. You know, those people couldn't express their thoughts because the rest of the society would blame them.
Yeah. So
Thank you.
so your first question was about why the journalists were not right. So so that's the journalists, and what this meant was not that they weren't paying attention to Trump, because they were covering him every day. I mean, he was the story, right, the whole time. He dominated, in our data, he dominated the news and Twitter every single week of the entire election. He dominated. Yeah. So they were covering him, but they weren't connected to his world in terms of their personal Twitter accounts. They were connected to other journalists and to Hillary and Bernie people. So they were in that world. So it's kind of the classic liberal bias of the media that we have always had in our country, which is unfortunate because we should be paying attention to both sides of the country, but we didn't have it. And I think they felt it wasn't necessary because they thought he didn't have a chance. And it's kind of like Donald Trump, TV star, who cares, it's a joke. Something very similar happened before the digital age in the 1980 election with Ronald Reagan. I was young, but I remember it. And everybody said the same thing, doesn't have a chance, movie star, who cares? The journalists just laughed it off, and he won. He won by a landslide, so that was different from Trump, who actually didn't win the popular vote, as you know. But that was the problem, is they weren't following the actual people in that world. It's not their world. It's not the coastal world. It's not. But to your second question, the Trump people are not, you know, ignorant. You know, there are some very prominent ignorant ones. But I knew smart people who voted for Trump. My wife and I have people on both sides of the family who voted for Trump. They kind of didn't talk about it. But then we sort of, you know, they eventually fessed up to it and were a little like embarrassed, but also really believed that was the right vote for them, but they were embarrassed to tell us. So, you know, it was real. And it was exactly what you described. And we've learned from it. So we sort of hope we're going to a better place now. And maybe we like to think in our lab that data science might be able to help as we move forward.
My name is Volodymyr, and I run a public relations agency here in Kyiv. And in your book, you wrote about how important it is to digitally disconnect and not to get enslaved to technology.
Yes.
In those 7 years, has your view on that changed in any way? And how does your personal behavior or procedure look like? Do you still take those digital sabbaticals?
Yeah, I still do that. So I write in the book about what we in my family call digital Sabbath, and or internet Sabbath we actually called it, and we just created it ourselves in 2007 because we were worried as a family we were really pulling apart from each other, particularly on the weekends when we were meant to have all this family time and we were just glued to our screens. And our son was in like, I don't know, 3rd or 4th grade at the time, and so he was young and growing up. It's kind of like, what are we doing? You know, we have to swear off this for 2 days a week. So we did that for 5 years. We were off internet both weekend days. And that was our internet Sabbath. Nobody had ever heard of it. Some of our friends were scared for us. You're going to be all right, your job, you know, oh my God. You know, do you want to stay in touch with me by landline? You know, all these things. And it was amazing. It was like it changed my life. I came back to my digital life on Monday with much more energy, creativity to offer because I'd been away from it. I love the internet. I love my Twitter life. I don't like Facebook that much, but I like my Twitter life a lot. And so it really worked. And the beauty of that experiment is that it's happening all over the place. You know, this whole idea of digital sabbaticals is really a movement, at least in the United States. I gather it's happening in other places. I've spoken to a lot of groups that are exploring that or doing it. A couple books have come out recently that credited me with starting it, which is actually not true. Most of these people started on their own, but I was the first person to write about it. And I think it's an awesome practice that I still do. So because of my work, I'm not able to do it both days anymore. I do Saturday offline, and that works for me. That's fantastic. But the team I work with, we sort of often have weekend emails, so I can't go both days anymore. As an independent writer, it wasn't a problem. But I still get massive benefits from it. And it's really still my main tech-related ritual that I do. Yeah.
Hello. My name is Olga, and I'm a member of parliament here. So, as a Ukrainian politician, I have to comment that your first slide is perfectly, idealistic if we compare it to, I would never call it a chaos,
Yeah.
If you come to, when we have our elections, presidential elections, I wonder which results you will have applying your techniques. So we invite you in 2 years, we will have yet another set of very interesting discussions around our presidential campaign. But my question is, usually when we talk about technology, we talk about all the great things which are available to human beings right now. But if you look at developed and developing world, I think while it is true that technology is offering a lot to developing countries, but it also means that with increase of technology in manufacturing, especially whichever path we take from your suggested cooperation with the robots or replacing, major technology by technology human beings, it may also mean that developed world will move back manufacturing to their own countries because they will not need cheap labor anymore.
Right.
Do you or your colleagues at MIT, who is known for creating a lot of great technologies, do you also run any kind of research around how it will impact the rest of us around the world?
Great question. We have work we do in the developing world, but not about that question. So we're doing more sort of work with communities on literacy and some other issues where devices are used to help people. We do have a member of our seminar, Stan, sorry to point you out, who knows a lot about the kind of question you asked. So maybe, I don't know if you want to come up and speak to it now? Or people could find you afterwards? Yeah, because this was real expertise that was discussing that from him, not me, during our seminar. So, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Ivan. I do government relations. I have 2 questions. One is it true that Trump campaign used social media in a more efficient way than the Hillary campaign? In a way that Hillary's message was unique for the whole crowd and Trump's was targeted to particular types of voters in the social media. And the second question is, there are door-to-door campaigns in the elections, and could you do like a profile-to-profile campaign, but using the chatbot, let's say, that would engage people first, feed them some articles, and then when they're ready for a real conversation, it would pass them to human campaigners that would kind of switch their...
To connect with the actual campaign.
Connect with it, yeah, but first work would be done by the chatbot, right? So you would unleash this chatbot and it will just campaign the whole thing and would get you the voters who are ready to switch the vote and engage with the human. Is it possible to build it now? Has it been built?
So on your first question, there's a big debate about that. Cambridge Analytica supposedly played a big role with helping. I actually don't know what the truth is about that. There was a lot of heat around that story right after the election, and then some people questioning it. I think on just visual inspection sort of in our experience following Twitter, it was clear that Trump was a master of that particular medium. He'd had all this experience from his Apprentice TV show days. He was really good at tweeting, which was a huge benefit to him. He came across as a real personality. Obviously, he's got a huge personality. Whatever you think of it, it's huge. And he was a very skillful messenger, messenger. And I think that was a massive asset for him. We did an analysis that we didn't publish, unfortunately, we should have, where we found that 10% of the people who were his most devoted followers, who followed only him among all the candidates from the beginning, 10% of those people had been following him since Apprentice days. So that was his kind of TV base, which is a lot of people. I mean, that's millions and millions of people was 10% of his followership. So that kind of shows you how he had mastered the medium. And when you looked at the Clinton sort of Twitter stream, at least, I don't know the Facebook data, it was more old school, little distant from the person, not super, she's not authentic anyway, and then, this was one more remove. So I think that was a problem. But in terms of the backroom data manipulation, I do not know what the real story is about that. Then on your second question, I have to think that chatbot thing is coming. I wasn't aware of it happening in this one. Maybe someone saw that happening, but I don't know of any campaign really using that in a massive way, but it's actually a great idea. I mean, think of the labor that you'd save, you know, of these young volunteers who do that kind of interacting normally. If you had a really smart bot that was, at least, as you said, taking the first step and making sure it was somebody who really wanted to engage and finding out what issues they cared about, it really does make sense. We didn't do any work looking at what the campaign professionals do. We just looked at the public sphere and people talking in the public sphere, so I don't pretend to have expertise, but it's a cool thought. Thank you.
My name is Victor. Thank you very much for your presentation. But when you talk of the public sphere and I look to this slide, I see different closed public spheres. So should we talk of not of public sphere but of many closed public spheres, closed communications, and the problem of the future is the conflict between these possible closed public spheres. For example, we have the same problem in Ukraine regarding the war on the east. So people who consider something like civil war, others consider that it's a war with Russians, they are absolutely separate. And we had this before, because people on the East Ukraine, they communicated only with each other, and on the West only with each other. Finally, we get the conflict. And then another thing, that communication also serves to some level like creating identities, the new identities in the closed communication, the new rules, the new norms, and finally the new moral. So the order you talk of should proceed from some moral norms which perceived by everybody. Yes, but what can happen in this case if we have the closed communication?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the public sphere, the writing about the public sphere and the scholarship has acknowledged the very thing that you talk about for a long time. And there's been all kinds of theory about multiple public spheres, and public spheres, some of them being exclusive, most of them being somewhat closed and exclusive, even going back to that idealized time in the 16 and 1700s. So I think that's always going to be the case to some extent because we're tribal beings, but I think the tribalization is at a kind of extreme point now, and the tightness of the particularly the Trump group that we saw in our data is not healthy, and the idea that we're that apart from each other cannot be good for society going forward. And we had a lot of parallel or echoing comments in our seminar of the Ukrainians talking about this issue in your recent history and us talking about it in our election. So it's clearly, there's a kind of a mirror thing happening there between the two societies, though the circumstances are very different. And I don't think we'll ever have the ideal, perfectly open, democratic, everybody has a voice, everybody's getting along public sphere. That's not our nature as beings, unfortunately. It may be a little bit boring too when you think about it. But I think we can do better than we're doing now. And I think that since it is happening on tech platforms, and it's not just people in coffee houses, you know, which was actually wonderful if we still had that, but with tech platforms, you can actually rebuild them, build new ones that might be designed to actually help solve this problem. So I think that's a possibility. Thank you.
The next question coming from me. Actually, during the seminar, we never asked it questions, only during the dinners.
Right.
So my question is, I've been to America many times.
Yep.
It's a big country.
Yep.
So we talk about the influence of media. First of all, we're focusing on New York Times, whatever, Boston Globe, or like the Washington Post, whatever. Liberal media, reaching the certain society, certain class, etc. Then you focus a lot on social media. But what about the role of regional media? Because I know it's been in decline in the United States. Many of them just disappeared. They didn't have money, etc. So what actually filled, or what can fill that space for regional media? Because they are the most influential in those areas where Trump's supporters live, because I've been to those states many times. Because actually they have the same issue in Ukraine, because it's a big country, 42 million people, and people living in regions. They don't really trust so-called central media.
Yeah, so absolutely right. We didn't pull in local media because it was actually too big of an order for us to fill with our small project. That is the media that people in small towns and communities trust the most. I actually live in a small town 2.5 hours out of Boston, and I know that the local media are the thing that people look to first, but I also know that they've become incredibly understaffed, and the quality has gone way down in the coverage, and it's almost not checking when it comes to things like national elections, because they just don't have the resources. They just run the wire stories that are appearing in the Washington Post and other places. So that's a big challenge, actually reinvigorating the media. It's happening now with the big ones because of Trump. There's been a huge jump in subscriptions and so forth of the big names. I wish it were happening in the communities, but I don't think it is. We are actually doing a project that's community-based, that's probably going to be in several communities, where we're going to work with both community influencers and hopefully media, where we look at addressing this problem. It's very nascent now. It hasn't really completely taken off yet, but we're hopeful that we might be able to learn some things that could help. We really haven't cracked the media puzzle in our country, or I guess anywhere in the world hasn't really cracked it. And so I really can't predict where. I don't want to be the person like Reader's Digest predicting, amazing, perfect media in 25 years, because I just don't know we're going to have that. It's sad. Thank you.
So any other questions? If no, I would like to thank you and round of applause to the Bill.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.